You have been praying for longer than you can count, for days, for weeks, perhaps for months, and at some point, without you noticing exactly when, something happened that is more dangerous than any financial crisis, more subtle than any spiritual attack someone could name from the outside. You began to believe that silence is the answer, not in a conscious way. You didn't wake up one day and say out loud, "God has abandoned me." It was more gradual than that. It was the sum of every prayer that seemed to hit the ceiling and come back down. It was the sum of every night waiting for a breakthrough that did not come. It was the slow accumulation of a sensation that was installed without asking permission. Perhaps the problem is me. Perhaps some mistake from my past has blocked the channel. Perhaps I am not faithful enough, pure enough, deserving enough for the answer to pass through. And once this filter was installed, something very specific and very devastating began to happen. Every subsequent prayer began to be filtered by it. Every new silence became new proof of the same conclusion. Every delay confirmed the abandonment you had not decided to believe in, but which you had begun to assume as true by default. If you recognize this state, I need you to understand one thing before anything else that this video will bring you. The delay is not your fault. The answer was sent on the first day. This is not a phrase of consolation. It is the description of a mechanism that is explicitly documented in Scripture, with a precision that will leave you without an argument to continue carrying the guilt for the silence you have lived through. And when you understand this mechanism, the way you position your spirit during the wait will change in a way that you will not be able to undo. Stay with me until the end, because what is to come is not generic encouragement. It is a specific key for a specific door that you closed without realizing you were closing it. If you are not yet subscribed to this channel, do it now. Here we do not work with shallow answers to deep questions. Subscribe and activate the bell. Let's go straight to the text that contains the most important revelation of this video. It is not an obscure or little-known text. It is a text that most people have read several times, but which is rarely developed in its entirety, because what it reveals challenges too much the popular theology that spiritual results are proportional to human performance. Daniel was a man of disciplined prayer. The text records that he prayed 3 times a day, with windows open toward Jerusalem, in a routine he maintained even when it was criminalized, and the penalty was death. It was not a faith of occasion. It was structural faith, incorporated into the routine of a man who had decided that prayer was non-negotiable, regardless of how much it cost to maintain it. And then came a period in which Daniel spent 3 weeks in mourning and fasting, 3 weeks without eating anything that gave him pleasure, without using ointment, without any comfort. The text does not tell us exactly what he was seeking in this period, but what it does tell us is that he had humbled himself before God with an intensity that corresponded to the weight of what he was carrying. And on the 24th day, there appeared before Daniel a being whose appearance the text describes with language that is the language of intense supernatural presence. Face like lightning, eyes like torches of fire, arms and legs like polished bronze, voice like the voice of a multitude. The men who were with Daniel did not see the being, but a trembling seized them, and they fled to hide. And Daniel was left alone before this presence. And then the being spoke, and what he said is the central revelation of this entire video. He said, "Daniel, man greatly beloved, understand the words that I speak to you and stand upright, for I have now been sent to you." And when he spoke these words to me, I stood up trembling. And he continued, "Fear not, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand and humbled yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come because of your words. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, and behold, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, and I remained there with the kings of Persia." Read this again with all the attention you have. From the first day. Your words were heard from the first day. The celestial being was sent on the first day, but he arrived 21 days later, not because Daniel had failed, not because Daniel had sinned, not because some mistake from Daniel's past had redirected or cancelled the answer, but because there was resistance in the spiritual realm that delayed the messenger without cancelling the message. The delay belonged to the war. It did not belong to Daniel's inadequacy. Like this video now if you need to hear this. If you spent weeks or months interpreting the delay as evidence that you are not enough, that something you did blocked the channel, that God's silence is proportional to your failure, Because what Daniel 10 establishes in a way that leaves no room for alternative interpretation is that the delay can be completely external to you. It can be spiritual warfare in the corridor, and the guilt you carried for this time was not yours to carry. There is a word in Hebrew that describes the posture Daniel maintained during those 21 days without knowing what was happening in the spiritual realm. The word is yakal, and the most common translation is to wait. But this translation, as happens with most fundamental Hebrew words, captures only the shell of what the original term carries. Yakal, in Hebrew, is not the passive waiting of someone who has no other option. It is a wait that contains within itself an active orientation toward what is to come. Hebrew linguists describe yakal as a tensioned wait, like the posture of someone who is ready to move the instant the instruction comes, who is neither asleep nor distracted, but who is in a state of oriented readiness. It is the difference between waiting sitting on a bus station bench without knowing if the bus will pass and waiting standing on the platform with the ticket in hand, looking in the direction from which the bus comes. What Daniel did during 3 weeks of fasting and mourning was yakal. He was not waiting because he had no alternative. He was waiting as someone who had placed real trust and who maintained the position not because of an absence of doubt, but by a decision to remain oriented toward the answer, even without evidence that it was on its way. And it is exactly in this distinction that the key lies which most people lose during the waiting period. The Max Planck Institute für Kognitions- und Neurowissenschaften, the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences, published research on the different neurological states produced by 2 distinct types of waiting. The first type, which researchers called passive or anxious waiting, is characterized by activation of the threat system. The prefrontal cortex becomes hypoactive, the limbic system takes control, cortisol levels rise, and the brain begins to scan the environment for signs of danger. In this state, any neutral stimulus, any silence, any delay, tends to be interpreted as a threat. The second type, which researchers called oriented or expectant waiting, is characterized by a completely different neurological pattern. The reward system remains active, the prefrontal cortex maintains executive function, and the brain remains open to identifying opportunities instead of scanning for threats. The difference between the 2 states was not in the duration of the wait nor in the external circumstances. It was in the internal orientation of the subject during the wait. Those who waited with a real expectation that something was on its way, even without external evidence of it, maintained a neurological state that made them perceivers of signs that those who waited with anxiety literally did not see, even if the signs were present in the same environment. Science is describing yakal in neurological language, and what it confirms is that the posture of oriented waiting is not only spiritually more efficient, it is biologically more efficient. The brain that waits with real expectation perceives more, processes better, and makes more precise decisions than the brain that waits in anxious survival mode. But now I need to enter the densest and most necessary part of this video. Because Daniel's problem was external, the spiritual war was in the corridor between the prayer and the answer. But there is a problem that is more internal than that, and which often operates simultaneously with spiritual warfare, without people realizing they are 2 distinct problems that require distinct approaches. It is what I call the internal agreement of abandonment. Write the word sent in the comments now. Just that one. Because by writing this word you are declaring that you understand the mechanism. The answer has already been sent. It is not on its way. It is not being considered. It has already been dispatched. And the delay belongs to the war in the corridor, not to your inadequacy. Write sent. The internal agreement of abandonment is not a conscious decision. No one deliberately chooses to believe that God has abandoned them. It is a process of gradual installation that happens completely underground, while the period of silence extends beyond what faith can sustain without new evidence. It works like this. You pray and receive no perceptible answer. First, you attribute the absence of an answer to God's sovereign will and His timing, and this is healthy and correct. But when the absence of an answer extends, a question begins to arise involuntarily. What if the problem is me? And this question, which begins as an isolated doubt, has a very specific property if it is not answered with a truth more solid than itself. It tends to install itself as a background assumption, not as a declared belief, as an operational filter, as the glasses through which all subsequent spiritual reality is read. And when this filter is installed, something clinically documented begins to happen. You begin to find confirmation for abandonment in absolutely everything. The unanswered prayer confirms the abandonment. But the answered prayer also does not undo the belief, because the filter finds a way to relativize it. It was a coincidence, it was my own effort, it wasn't God. The abandonment filter is self-perpetuating because it processes any evidence, positive or negative, in a way that confirms the conclusion it has already established. Fiocruz, in research conducted in partnership with neuroscience centers on core belief formation processes, documented the phenomenon that researchers called negative cognitive crystallization, the process by which a strongly emotionally charged belief, especially a belief about one's own identity or about the relationship with primary attachment figures, becomes progressively resistant to revision by contradictory evidence. In other words, once the belief of abandonment crystallizes, the brain develops active filtering mechanisms that protect the belief from information that contradicts it, not out of bad faith, out of a neurological function of protecting internal coherence that the brain executes automatically. What does this mean in practice? That the person who has developed the abandonment filter can receive a visible answer to prayer and still not be able to integrate it as proof that they were not abandoned. The filter simply finds another interpretation, and each cycle of unanswered prayer deepens the crystallization, making it progressively harder to dissolve only through new experiences. The only thing that dissolves negative cognitive crystallization is not new external evidence. It is the replacement of the core belief with a truer and more deeply rooted belief. It is the installation of a filter more powerful than the abandonment filter. And this more powerful filter has a name. It is the certainty rooted in the mechanism of Daniel 10. The answer was sent on the first day. Silence is not evidence of your inadequacy. It is evidence of a war that is happening on a plane that your eyes cannot reach, but which your faith can anchor with a firmness that is more solid than any sensory evidence that silence produces. Now I want to take you to a second story that will add a dimension that Daniel alone cannot provide. Because Daniel shows us the mechanism of the delay. But there is someone who shows us how to position ourselves during the delay in a way that is at once more solitary and more powerful than anything most people imagine when they think of spiritual waiting. The prophet Habakkuk lived in one of the most disorienting periods in Israel's history, a period in which violence seemed to reign without interruption, in which the wicked prospered while the righteous suffered, in which the logic of divine retribution seemed completely inverted. And Habakkuk's response to this imbalance was not silence or conformity. It was a direct and unveiled complaint. O Lord, how long shall I cry, and thou wilt not hear? Even cry out unto thee of violence, and thou wilt not save. The text does not condemn Habakkuk for this complaint. God does not rebuke him for bringing injustice to the divine court with unfiltered language. On the contrary, God answers, not immediately with a solution, but with an instruction on how Habakkuk should position himself while the full answer does not manifest. And then Habakkuk did something that is the heart of all wisdom on how to cross the period between the question and the answer. He said, I will stand upon my watch, and set me upon the tower, and will watch to see what he will say unto me, and what I shall answer when I am reproved. I will stand, I will set myself, I will watch. 3 active verbs, 3 positioning decisions. Not passive waiting on the ground where the confusion was, a deliberate climb to a higher point, intentional positioning in a posture of observation, active vigil to receive what was to come. There is a word in Hebrew that Habakkuk uses in this scene, which is the second essential term of this video. The word is mishmeret. It is the word for guard post, watch place, the position of the sentinel. Mishmeret is not just a physical location. It is a posture of responsibility. The sentinel at the mishmeret is not there because they have nowhere better to be. They are there because it is their designated post, and because there is a specific responsibility that can only be fulfilled from that place. Habakkuk climbed to the Mishmeret, not because he had received a revelation that the answer was arriving, but because he decided that the correct posture during the wait was that of a responsible sentinel, of someone who had assumed the post and who was going to remain in it until receiving instruction to move. And God answered, "Write the vision and make it plain upon tables, that he may run that readeth it. For the vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it shall speak, and not lie. Though it tarry, wait for it, because it will surely come, it will not tarry." Though it tarry, wait for it. Yachal, the same root. The oriented, tensioned wait of the Mishmeret, of the sentinel who does not abandon the post, even when the corridor remains silent for much longer than what seemed reasonable to expect. Activate the bell now so you don't miss the next video on this channel, because we are going to enter into something that is the direct continuation of what you are learning here. We will reveal what happens to the sentinel who leaves the post exactly before the message arrives, and why the most critical moment of all waiting is not the beginning, when faith is still alive, but the moment just before the manifestation, when the fatigue of the vigil is heavier than at any other point in the journey. You will want to have the bell activated for that video. But now I need to give you the most practical and most urgent dimension of everything you are learning. Because Mishmeret, the watchpost, requires a very specific inner quality that most people confuse with something else, and which is why they cannot maintain it for long enough. This quality is called in Hebrew shakat. Shakat is sometimes translated as quietness, sometimes as rest, sometimes as ease. But it is important to note what differentiates shakat from other words for rest that appear in Scripture. Shakat is not the rest that follows the conclusion of a work, that is, menuha. It is not the peace that is a consequence of prosperity and established security. Shakat is the quietness that exists in the middle of the storm. It is the state of internal calm that is maintained by a deliberate choice in conditions that would justify any other response. In Isaiah, shakat appears in a promise that needs to be read in its entirety to have the weight it carries. In returning and rest shall ye be saved. In quietness and in confidence shall be your strength. In quietness and in confidence shall be your strength. Not in noise, not in agitation, not in the multiplication of emergency exit strategies. In quietness, in shakat. In the state of internal calm that is maintained not because the situation is tranquil, but because confidence in what is happening beyond visibility is more solid than the fear the situation is producing. And here is what is most important about shakat, and which is rarely taught. Shakat is not natural in a state of pressure. It is a choice. It is a deliberate act of refusal to enter into agitation when agitation would be the most biologically natural response available. IPEA, the Institute for Applied Economic Research, published longitudinal analyses on resilience indicators in Brazilian populations of different socioeconomic profiles during periods of high pressure. One of the most consistent and counterintuitive findings was that the individuals who demonstrated the greatest capacity to maintain what researchers called internal state regulation during prolonged crises, that is, who managed to maintain a basic level of calm and orientation even in conditions of high adversity, were not necessarily those who had more external resources available or those who were objectively in less severe situations. They were those who had developed what researchers called an anchor of meaning, an interpretative framework that transcended immediate circumstances and provided an explanation for adversity that did not invalidate the trajectory nor confirm abandonment. In non-academic language, the people who survived the longest crises without internal collapse were not the most favored. They were the ones who had a story to tell about what was happening to them that was truer than the story the crisis wanted to tell about them. The mechanism of Daniel 10 is exactly this anchor of meaning. It is the truer story. The answer was sent on the first day. The corridor has war. The delay is not my inadequacy. This story, installed as a filter deeper than the abandonment filter, changes shakat from impossible to possible. Not easy, not without cost, but possible. And now I need to talk about a third moment in Scripture that will close the arc of everything you are learning. It is a moment that is rarely developed at the level of depth it deserves because what happens there seems too simple to be as powerful as it is. In the first chapter of the Acts of the Apostles, Yeshua had risen and had presented himself to the disciples for 40 days, and then he gave them the last instruction before the ascension. It was not an instruction to go, to preach, to act. It was an instruction to wait. He told them, "Depart not from Jerusalem, but wait for the promise of the Father, which ye have heard of me. For John truly baptized with water, but ye shall be baptized with the Holy Ghost not many days hence." And what the disciples did with this instruction is what the text records in a way that is very brief, but carries immense weight. These all continued with one accord in prayer. 10 days, 10 days of waiting between the instruction to wait and Pentecost, 10 days in which, from an external point of view, absolutely nothing visible was happening. 10 days in which the temptation to leave, to return to Galilee, to resume fishing, to find something else to do while the promise did not arrive must have been enormous. And they stayed, and they prayed. With a quality of unanimity that the text emphasizes in an unusual way, they were of one accord, not just geographically in the same space, internally oriented in the same direction, collective mishmeret, shared yachal. Shakat, sustained by a community that had decided that the post was the post and that what had been promised was going to arrive. And on the 10th day the answer arrived, and it was not a discrete answer. It was the inauguration of a movement that changed the course of human history. The 10 days of Shakat were not passivity. They were the condition that made possible what came after. Quietness was not the opposite of action. It was the specific environment within which the most powerful action those people would ever execute would be initiated. There is a fourth Hebrew term I want to deliver as the final gift of this video. The word is achar. It means to delay, to tarry, to arrive after the expected time. And it appears in the text of Habakkuk exactly at the point where God speaks about the vision that has not yet arrived, though it tarry achar, wait for it. But what is theologically extraordinary about the use of achar in this context is what it implies about the nature of divine time. The achar is not an error. It is not a failure of planning. It is not proof that the promise was illusory or that the one who made it lacks the capacity to fulfill it. The achar is recognized as a real possibility, and yet it does not invalidate the promise. On the contrary, the promise is pronounced in a way that includes the achar as a variable. Though it tarry, it will still come. The delay is within the scope of the promise, not outside of it. This is theologically revolutionary for whoever is in the middle of the achar now, because it means that the timing of the manifestation was not wrong in the original plan. The delay was foreseen, not as a deviation from the promise, but as part of the terrain through which the promise would need to pass. And the question that the achar poses to the one waiting is not, has God forgotten? The question is, will you remain in the mishmeret until what was promised crosses the corridor where the war is happening? The answer you are waiting for did not cancel its trip because of your inadequacy. It is passing through difficult territory. There is resistance in the corridor. There is war in the plains you do not see, but which are more real than anything your senses capture. And what God is asking of you is not improved performance. It is not more fasting, more intensity, more effort to compensate for what you believe you did wrong. It is mishmeret. It is the post. It is remaining oriented in yachal, with the shakat of one who knows that what was sent on the first day is on its way. The abandonment filter will try to convince you that staying at the post is naivety, that mature people accept when a door is closed, that there is a point where persisting stops being faith and becomes stubbornness. And there is a real distinction there that is worth naming. There are moments when God redirects. There are moments when no is the answer, and discerning those moments is a real spiritual skill that requires maturity. But the question is not whether no exists as a possible answer. The question is your belief in the no at this moment coming from spiritual discernment, or is it coming from the abandonment filter? Is it coming from a clear reading of the situation from shakat, from internal quietness that allows for precise listening, or is it coming from the fatigue of the vigil which is being interpreted by the installed filter as confirmation of what the filter had already decided? Because these two things feel very similar on the inside, and the difference between them is the difference between the disciple who leaves Jerusalem on the 9th day, because they genuinely understood that God was redirecting them, and the disciple who leaves on the 9th day because they were so exhausted that the abandonment filter converted exhaustion into revelation. The Max Planck Institute also published specific research on the phenomenon that neuroscientists call the confusion between internal state and external signal, the tendency of the brain, especially in states of prolonged fatigue, to interpret internal emotional states as information about the external world. In other words, when you are exhausted from waiting, the fatigue begins to feel like information about the object of the wait, not just information about your internal state. The exhaustion of the vigil begins to be read as evidence that what you are watching for does not exist or will not arrive. Not because it is true, but because the fatigued brain can no longer clearly distinguish between what it is feeling and what is happening. It is exactly at this point that shakat is most necessary and most difficult. It is exactly when the exhaustion of the vigil is being processed as revelation that you most need an anchor of meaning external to your internal state. Something that says, what you are feeling now is real and legitimate exhaustion, but it is not information about whether the promise will be fulfilled. It is information about how long you have been at the post, and the fact that you are tired does not mean it is time to leave. It may mean it is time to be renewed to continue. Elijah under the juniper tree had exhaustion that led him to ask to die, and God did not rebuke him nor confront him with his mission. He sent bread and water. He let him sleep, and the instruction came later when he had been restored. Because there are moments when the correct response to the fatigue of the vigil is not to leave the post. It is to receive the care that allows one to remain. You may be in this place now, in the place where the body needs bread and rest before receiving instruction. And this is not spiritual weakness. It is not a sign that you failed in the vigil. It is the recognition that you are human and that God's grace finds exactly in your humanity the canvas where it operates with most evidence, not despite it. The answer was sent on the first day, not on the day you become sufficiently faithful, not on the day you find the right prayer or the correct spiritual frequency. On the first day you humbled yourself and set your heart to understand. That day has already passed. The answer has already departed. It is in transit in a corridor with war, and your task now is not to pray with more intensity to make the answer move faster. It is to maintain the mishmeret. It is to remain at the post in Yachal. It is to protect the shakat from contamination by the abandonment filter that will try to replace the certainty of the sending with the doubt of the arrival. You are not in a cycle of punishment. You are in a corridor with war. And you are not being instructed to enter the corridor and fight. You are being instructed to remain on this side, at the post, in a posture of reception, because what was sent will break through. There is a moment you had. A moment when you were quiet when you should have shouted, when you chose not to react when you had every argument to react, when you simply remained at the post, when everything around you said the post was empty and that nothing was going to arrive. You interpreted that moment as weakness. You probably still do. But that moment was shakat. It may have been your most precise cooperation with an instruction you did not know you had received. The quietness you held in that moment may have been the signal that kept the channel open for what is coming. Not because your spiritual performance was impeccable, but because at some level deeper than the conscious, you maintained the post when the post most needed to be maintained. Share this video now with someone who is convinced that silence is the definitive answer, who installed the abandonment filter without realizing it, and who is reading every delay as confirmation. Because the most precise gift you can give this person is not advice or strategy. It is the language of Daniel 10. It is knowing that the answer was sent on the first day and that the corridor has war, not guilt. This information can completely change what they do with the time that remains at the post. And write in the comments, sent, because you know now, it is not going to be sent, it was sent, it is in transit. The achar is within the scope of the promise, not outside of it, and you will be at the mishmeret when it crosses the corridor and arrives. Until the next video.